Hey there, I hope you're doing well. Today we'll be doing a rough overview of XR Toolkit 2.0 using OpenXR in Unity 2021. We'll be covering the initial package setup, basic interactions, and Locomotion, just to name a few. And this is going to be a pretty long video, so get comfortable, get a drink, and let's get started. And I imagine you're probably going to be wondering, well, what version, Andrew, should I be using? Well, I'm going to be using 2021.2.13. And if you've done any VR development before, you'll know that versions can change with time and how the exact workflow can differ from within 6 months fairly rapidly. As of recently though, it's slowed down, so hopefully this video has a little bit more of a lifespan on it. But you'll see here that I have an empty project. You can see up here in the left hand corner that I am using 2021.2.13, and I've pretty much done nothing. I haven't set up anything beforehand. This is completely empty. So when you set it up, it should more or less look exactly like this. I know I've probably moved some of my panels around here, but this is just how I like to work. The first thing that we're going to be doing is getting OpenXR set up. And if you're not familiar with what OpenXR is, it's one of the newer standards for getting all of our different hardwares to be interpreted the same way within our program. So we don't have to sit here and be like, oh, if it's an Oculus, do this. If it's a Vive, do this. Unity's system, with the fact that it's implemented OpenXR with its new input system, or just the input system probably at this point, does a lot of the heavy lifting for us and is a bit of an abstraction layer between the hardware and the code that we're writing. So some of this may seem a bit dense at first, but know that it is saving us a lot of time and effort. So let's go ahead and let's go up to our window. Let's go to Package Manager, and it's going to take a second to load. And we're going to want to go up to this drop down here and just go to Unity Registry. And we can either scroll down to the bottom, or let's see if we can just type it in here. I'm going to type in OpenXR. And I'm going to be using 1.3.1, I think. Let's see what the recommended version. Yep, that's what it is. Since we're working in 2021 currently, there have been some recent changes to the package manager where they're not letting us have a history of versions. They're trying to prioritize stability in the engine, so they're only going to give us release versions of some of these packages. And I kind of understand why. But for me personally, I do like having the opportunity to switch between packages if there's a bug, or just to make sure that the behavior that I'm getting is the intended one. But enough of that side note. Let's hit install. And then with the power of movie magic, I may speed this up, but in the meantime, let's take a drink, because that was part of the tutorial. You need to make sure you have a drink. I have it in this nice, what would you call this? Watercolor mug or something that my brother got me for Christmas. If you hear the ice in there, it's because it's not a hot beverage. All of our glasses were dirty. Okay, well, we're still importing here. Yeah, I feel like I'm most certainly going to need to speed this up in post. I usually do. Alright, and during the process of putting in OpenXR, we're going to get this warning. And I'll just read this bottom paragraph for you. It says, do you want to, well, that actually doesn't make any sense. Let's just read the whole thing. This project is using the new input system package, but the native platform backends for the new input system are not enabled in the player settings. This means that no input from native devices will come through. Do you want to enable the backends? This is such a hard thing to read. I haven't read this thing fully in such a long time, if you haven't noticed, but doing so will restart the editor and will disable the old engine input APIs. So this is kind of what I was talking about earlier. We need to use these updated input systems if we want to successfully get values from our hardware. So we just want to hit yes here. And we're going to be doing another loading bar. And your editor is going to restart. That's perfectly normal. Don't worry too much. It didn't crash on you. But then the editor will reopen pretty much as we had before. Right now, we'll go ahead and we'll exit out of this. We will be coming back to the package manager to put in XR Toolkit, but that's going to be a whole nother process. But what we're first going to need to do is configure OpenXR. So we're going to go to File. We can either go to our Build Settings, or we can go to Edit, Project Settings. We're just going to go to our Project Settings here. I'm going to go ahead and maximize this window so it's easier for us to see. And you'll notice that we have this XR plugin management now. If we came here before we installed OpenXR, there was just going to be a button here that just says Install XR Plugin Management. So just installing OpenXR will do that process for us. But you'll notice that we have these plugin providers here. We have Oculus, we have OpenXR, and we have this Unity Mock HMD. What we're going to want to do, since we're using OpenXR, since we want to target a lot of different platforms, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to click that. And there may be a short process here, but mine seemed to do it pretty quick. But you'll notice that there's going to be this little yellow triangle here. We're going to want to click that because it's going to let us know what we're going to need to do to get OpenXR fully running within our project. When this was first released, there was a number of things here that we would have to click through, but now it's just letting us know we need to enable an interaction profile. So we'll hit edit, and it's going to just bring us down to this little OpenXR here. So we were here a moment ago, it's just going to bring us down here so we can be a little bit more specific with the settings that we're using for OpenXR. The only thing that we're really going to want to do here is we're going to have this plus sign here, and you're going to want to add whatever controller that you're essentially going to be using. And this is just going to be some of the values. That's going to be that sort of abstraction layer that I talked about, where it's going to be getting inputs from our controller and it's going to be sort of funneling them into a sort of unified interface that Unity can work with. And for me, the valve index, that's going to be all the way down at the bottom. And at this point, we pretty much have a VR compatible project. However, we're also going to be wanting to use XR Toolkit. We'll exit out of both of these OpenXR windows. We'll go back to Window, and we'll open up the Package Manager. And like before, we'll go to our search bar, and we'll type in XR Toolkit. And one thing you'll notice is that there aren't any results for XR Toolkit. If you're using an earlier version like Unity 2020, it should pop up. But like I said previously about the changes in the Package Manager, we're going to have to jump through a little bit, or another hoop essentially, to install XR Toolkit. If you're watching this in the future, it may have already popped up for you and you just need to install like usual. But for right now, if you're watching this as this video releases, we're going to need to do something a little bit extra. So I'm going to open up a website page right now. And if we refer to that page in the documentation that we saw previously, we can see that it says there are no pre-released packages for this release, which is really interesting because if we go up to the version dropdown here and we go to the version right before it, you'll see that it specifically has XR Interaction Toolkit here marked as a pre-release. So at this point, we want to copy this com.unity.xr.interaction toolkit, and then we just want to go back into Unity. And now that we're back in the package manager, we'll click this plus sign here, and we'll say add package by name. And we'll just want to paste that in there. And we'll hit add, and it's going to start to install the package for us. Like I said before, this may not be a process that you need to go through, but I guess this is what we got to do right now. And with the introduction of 2.0, they've added some new interaction layer mask stuff. We're not going to be dealing with this too much, but we'll just go ahead and hit I made a backup, go ahead. All right, and it looks like it's done. Let's go back up to the upper left here, and we'll go to the current Unity. We'll go to in project. Well, let's clear our search here. And it should come up XR Interaction Toolkit at the bottom of your packages within your project. What we're now going to want to do is we're going to want to expand this arrow here. And there's going to be this samples. We'll click that as well. One thing to take note of is that we are indeed in 2.0 and it is currently marked as release, which we'll see again there. So I'm not exactly sure what the current status is or who manages, whether it's on the toolkit side of things or the package manager. We're not going to worry about it too much. What we will need to do is input our starter assets. So we'll click that. And what this is going to have is a bunch of input settings that we're not going to have to set up manually. It's really going to accelerate the process for getting our project up and off the ground. This is something you do not want to do manually. It's not a very fun process. But we will be taking a brief look at these assets to see if we want to make adjustments in the future, if you need to for your project. So now that we have all that done, let's exit out of the package manager. And technically, we've done all of the painful project setup. So now the first thing that we're going to do, well, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my notes and we're going to set up our camera rig. But before we even do that, we're going to need a bit of a floor to kind of know what's going on within our scene. So I'm going to right click in my hierarchy and I'm going to go to 3D object and I'm just going to hit plane. So now we have a bit of a floor to work with. Then we're going to right click again in our hierarchy and we're going to go down to XR, where this is going to have a bunch of useful already set up things that's going to make the process a little bit quicker for setting up our project. Usually for a project, I would hit XR origin action based, which we'll just do that right now just so we can take a look at it. And we'll see here that it has a number of sub-objects to it. It has this camera offset, it has the camera itself, and these two controllers. The XR origin is essentially going to be our play space, and it's going to have some functionality for rotating the player as well as moving them, but that's not something that we're going to be interfacing with directly. This is usually going to be called from things that are going to be teleporting the player within our project. But something we will be doing in just a moment is working with the tracking origin mode. But we're not going to be specifically starting with this one because on the controllers, it has all of this interaction stuff already set up for us, which we'll be setting up ourselves in the future. So we'll be disabling this for the time being, or if you can, I'll just go ahead and delete it actually. And we'll come back into our hierarchy and right click, and we'll go to XR, and we'll just click this XR origin down here. And when we click that, we'll get something that looks very similar to that XR origin we just saw. But if we expand this, you'll notice that we don't have our controllers here. Because like again, we're going to be setting those up ourselves. Because we're going to be starting with a different type of interactor, which we'll talk about more in just a second. But what we will do is that currently the tracking mode is not specified, where this is for older headsets generally if they only have 3 degrees of freedom, meaning they only track rotation. This would be the old like Gear VR or Oculus Go or Google Cardboard. We've largely moved on from that, and even the more off-the-shelf sort of headsets have 6 degrees of freedom, meaning they track the position as well. So all we're going to need to do here is just go from not specified to floor, since this is most likely the type of headset you're going to be using, and this includes things like the Oculus Quest, Vive, or Index. And we're going to test this in just a second, but let's click on our main camera really quick. And you'll notice like before, or like always on our camera, we have a camera component, but more specifically, we have this track pose driver that's already set up for us, which already has references to some input actions, which we will talk about briefly in a little bit, where it's already going to be getting the position of our headset as well as rotation and applying it to our main camera here. And we're going to test that in just a second. So right now, if you haven't set up your play space yet, turn it on now, which I haven't done, so I'm going to do that now. So as all of that sort of starts to power on, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save my scene, and I'm going to hit play. And I'm currently using SteamVR, so if I go ahead and drag that window over, you'll see that I have both of my lighthouses on as well as my headset that's standing by for input. So I'm going to pick my headset up, and you'll see that it's already beginning to track its position and rotation. So we really haven't even done anything extra with XR Toolkit or the inputs or anything like that, but we're getting tracking in our headset already. So at this point, that should work. If that didn't work, you may want to review some of the steps that I've already gone over and see if there's something that you may have missed. Because now, this is where we're going to get into the XR Toolkit side of things, where now we need to set up our controllers. So kind of like we saw with that other XR origin, let's come to our camera offset, and we're going to create a couple of empty game objects. We'll have one that we'll just call left hand. I'm going to duplicate this by just hitting Control D, and then I'm just going to call this right hand. And then we can select both of those game objects, and we're going to add the XR controller component. More specifically, we're going to be using the action-based version. And we want to be using action-based because if you remember, when we were putting OpenXR into our project, it gave us that little prompt for using the new input system. And action-based essentially means new input system, and you'll see why in just a second. So if we add these to our empty game objects here, you'll see that we now have all of these different actions here, which it's going to be its position of the controller, the rotation, the current tracking status, as well as all of these different inputs from haptics to activating and selecting. I know that's a lot to take in, but we're going to kind of be stepping through a lot of it, so don't worry too much about it. But for our controllers to work, we need to have some actions here. And this may look a little bit familiar, because if we go back to our main camera, you'll see that it also had these sort of input action type things. So if we go back to our controller, if we wanted to, we can hit this plus sign, we can add a similar setup. But as you can imagine, going through all of these different actions would be kind of a pain. So this is where those like sample assets that we put into previously are going to come into play. And we can actually find those from our samples folder, XR Interaction Toolkit, starter assets, and it's going to be these default input actions here, which this is also a lot to take in, and we'll look at this more closely in just a second. But let's apply these to our controllers here. And you may be wondering, how do we do that? Well, it's pretty simple. We also have these different presets that we can apply to our controllers, so we don't have to drop them in manually. So we'll go to our left hand here. We can hit this little icon with these two little slider bars here, and you'll see that we have a preset for our left and our right controller. This most likely looks like this on your screen, but if you drag the slider all the way to the left, it'll give you a list view, so it's a little bit easier to see. And I'm just going to hit the left controller, exit out of that, and I'm going to do the same thing for my right controller. And right now we pretty much we're nearly there for actually having tracked controllers. So what we need to do now is that for some reason, the controllers are not responsible for activating these actions. So we need an extra component to activate those as well. So we'll go to, you can do this on an empty game object, but I like doing it on the XR origin. It is the interaction or the input action manager. So we'll add that. And we'll just need to add that asset that I just pointed out to you earlier, which is the XRI default input actions. And at this point, we technically have all of our input and our tracking and all of that set up. But that was a lot of kind of input mumbo jumbo that may not make a lot of sense to you right now. So let's take a second and let's explain that a little bit further. So if we double click on this XRI default input actions asset, and then we'll expand it, this is essentially where the values from our controller are sort of being abstracted into things that we can use within our project. So if we click either the left or the right hand, you'll see that we have all of these different actions. And the easiest one to understand is probably going to be the position here. So if we expand that, we'll see that we get a vector3 value from it. And this vector3 value is being received from our device position, more specifically our left-hand XR controller. So what this is essentially doing is getting the values from our controller and kind of giving them a name. The one thing that we're going to be working with in a bit with interactables is selecting, activating, as well as pressing the UI. We have a ton of different actions here that aren't as important to the sort of core functionality, but are useful when it comes to interacting with user interface or teleporting and things like that. But as a quick primer before we get into actual interactions, the select currently is more or less how we pick up an object. And if we wanted to see, we can currently select an object by pressing the grip. If you wanted to come in here and maybe change this value to something else, you would come in here into your XR controller, specifically the left hand, optional controls, and you would have all of these different inputs that you can use. I wouldn't advise doing this right now unless you are a bit more advanced, because some of these work, some of them are a bit more difficult to work with, but it's just good to know right now that it's here. You can also have multiple inputs for a particular action as well. And I have an older video that's dedicated to going into all of this more in depth, so we're just kind of scratching the surface here, and I'll probably link that video down in the description. So I think that's enough for input actions. We largely don't have to worry about it right now, but it's good to be aware that it's there. So exit out of that. And now let's hit play to make sure our project is all working. Since we don't have any objects for our hands, we're not really going to be able to check to see if our tracking is working particularly well. But if we go into our scene view here, and we just select one of our controllers, I'm going to activate my right controller right now. And once I put on my headset, you'll see in my scene view here that the transform of my hand is actually moving. So that looks like it's working perfectly well. So you should be getting some values within your inspector when your hand has been selected. If you look in my upper right hand corner here, you can see that the position and rotation are being updated. So everything looks to be working as expected. And I think that's enough for our first little session. So let's take a quick break and we'll be back in 5 minutes. Well, not real time 5 minutes, probably like 5 seconds. All right, see you then. Hello and welcome back. It's time to do the fun part, interactions, which is probably why you're here to begin with. But we're going to be talking about interactors, interactables, how they talk to one another, and some of the things that we can take advantage of when we're making things for our project. But let's talk a little bit more about what an interactable is. It's something that we can pick up, and it's something that we can use. Your hand would be an interactor. So your hand is going to be the interactor, and the screwdriver is going to be the interactable. There's a few different things that interactables can do, or the things that we can sort of tap into essentially. When your hand touches the screwdriver, or the interactable, that's known as a hover. When you grab it, that's known as a select. But then we have another action called the activate action. When you're holding the object with the grip button, like we looked at previously, and you pull the trigger, that is the activate action. And let's set something up or set up a grabbable object. But before we need that, we need a way to visualize our controllers. And this is where I usually just use spheres. If you have a hand asset you can use, you're more than welcome to do that. But for right now, I don't want you to have to go and download something. So we're going to come into our hierarchy here, and I'm going to create a 3D object, then I'm just going to make it a sphere. I don't have any materials right now, so we can actually make one really quick, and you can make it whatever color you want. I'm just going to call this m_hands, and I'm just going to make mine. I have all these beautiful swatches here. Let's make it this color. This is where the fun customization part of the project, you can make it whatever color you want. But I'm just going to make my sphere a different color here. Drag and drop that on there. One thing that we'll want to do is remove the collider on it as well, or we're going to get some pretty weird results, I'd imagine. Or we'll also want to change the scale to something a bit more usable. I also want to rename this, so you can select it and you can hit F2, and then you can just type hand. And we could turn that into a prefab by just dragging it into our assets folder. And now we have this little object that we can use to show where our hands are in the scene. And usually you would probably just think, oh yeah, I could just child this object onto the hand here. But that means it's always going to be displayed and XR Toolkit isn't going to be able to use it. So we'll just delete that now. Because within the XR controller, we have this model section here and we have this model prefab. So what this will do is if we select both of our controllers and we'll drag our prefab into it, this will be spawned once our scene starts. And this is useful because when you pick up an object, it's going to disable this hand prefab that we have, so it's not sitting on top of the object that we've picked up. And if we want to, we can hit play again to make sure that that's working as expected. So with my headset on, you'll see that I'm moving my controller and our sphere is in the correct place and it's following correctly with our controller. And if we want to, we can come in here within our hierarchy and you'll see that we have these additional assets, or not assets, but game objects that are created when our project starts. If we wanted to change the position or rotation of our hand, we also have this model parent here. But this is going to be the version of our hand prefab that's going to be instantiated every time we start our project. That's pretty much it for that. And we now need to actually add the interactor to our controller. I did sort of mention that our hand is essentially an interactor, but there are different kinds of interactors that we can work with. We can use ones that use triggers, so they're going to be more behaving like a hand, so your hand needs to get near the interactable before you can use it. But we have other ones that are based on using ray casting. So if you don't want to bend over to pick something up and you want to just point at it and be able to pick it up, we can use ray interactors as well. We're not going to be using those right now because direct interactors are usually going to be most likely what you're going to be working with. But there are also different kinds of interactors that aren't sort of related to your hand at all. We have sockets and things like that as well, where if you wanted to attach something to your shoulder or your head or something like that, that would be a socket. So it's still going to be looking for those interactors, but those are going to be essentially behaving on their own. And we'll probably look into those very briefly as well. So for the interactor that's going to be closest to what we sort of think of as a hand, that's going to be called the direct interactor. So if we come into our inspector here, we'll just write XR direct interactor. And there's a lot of different settings and things that we can use here. For one, if you wanted to have it based on when you are actually picking up an object, where either you want it to be a toggle or whenever the value changes, or if you just want, once the object is picked up, they can't necessarily get rid of it. But we're just going to keep this setting as is. If you have a lot of different sort of interactables in your scene and you only want specific interactors to be able to interact with those things, you would put them on the same layer mask. We're not going to be working with that, but that's just something good to know. Or if you want to have an interactable that is automatically selected when your project starts, we have this here as well. But the main thing that we're going to be looking at is selecting both of our hands here and checking this hide controller on select. Because if you remember, we put that prefab in our hand slot earlier. So if we check this box, it'll hide that game object when we pick up an object. And now we need something to actually pick up. So let's come over into our hierarchy again, and we'll right click and we'll just create a cube, and we'll hold control and we'll just drag up. And what control it's going to do, it's going to snap it to increments of 0.25 to make sure it's completely flush with our ground. If we want to, we can apply our our beautiful material that we made earlier to it if we want to. And now, all we need to do is come into XR, and it already has a handy dandy grab interactable for us to use. So if we click that, it's going to be hidden in your box here, but if we click and drag up on that, you'll see that we have this cube here that has a box collider, a rigid body, and a grab interactable. However, before we get into that, one thing I completely almost glazed over is if we go back to our controllers, you'll see that we added our direct interactor here, but if you remember, I mentioned that it works with a trigger. We need to make sure we add that. If we don't, it would actually give us a warning. So I'm going to just show you that really quick. If we do hit play, it's going to tell us that our direct interactor does not have a required collider set as a trigger. And now we come to our controllers again, and we're going to add a sphere collider. And we'll make sure to mark it as a trigger. And we're just going to make this a little bit smaller. I'm going to go with 0.1. But you can play around this to see what works best for you. So now that's set up correctly. Let's go back to our grab interactable. And interactables in XR Toolkit are pretty, I wouldn't say they're complex, but there's a lot of things to sort of learn and grasp. So don't try and get everything in this first go. There are a lot of other great videos on YouTube that will go into this in more detail. Like I said, this whole video is a bit of a brief overview just to kind of get you started. But what we do have, or things that I will sort of point out to you, is the movement type. We have instantaneous, velocity, and kinematic. Instantaneous is more or less moving it via transform, so it's not really going to have any collision and it's going to follow directly with the hand. Kinematic basically means that your interactable, once you grab it, can interact with other physics objects. And then velocity tracking means it will collide with any other collider within your scene. Most people opt in for the velocity tracking, but if you have a very specific game, it may be useful to exercise one of these other two options. But for now, since velocity tracking is the most interesting, we're just going to click that. And now that we have that set up, let's just see if this works. Let's hit play. And now I've grabbed my object and I've moved back to my microphone. You'll see that we have actually successfully picked up our object and we can move it around. So everything looks to be working as expected there. What we will also do now is talk about some of those events that I kind of briefly mentioned when we were looking at some of the input actions, is the interactable events down here. There's a lot that you can work with, but we're not going to be going over all of them right now. The biggest things we need to know about are the sort of things we've already touched on, which includes hovering, selecting, as well as activating. And I'll show a quick example of this in just a second, but let's not move on from interactors and interactables just yet. What we can also do is have those socket interactors that I've already talked about as well. So if we change up our scene view here a little bit, and I go back into my hierarchy, and I go to XR, you'll see that we also have the socket interactable, or just the socket interactor, sorry. Where if we take that and we move it up a little bit, you'll see that much like our direct interactor, it also uses a collider, where we can usually use this as some sort of basic inventory system where it is connected to our head, or we use it as a sort of belt or something like that. But just to show you a brief example, if we come over to the XR socket interactor, you'll remember that we did point out the starting selected interactable from before. Let's just click and drag our interactable into this. And if we hit play, we'll go to our scene view really quick. You'll see that the socket has essentially grabbed our interactable already. And if we want to, we can actually take the interactable from the socket and give it back to it. So I'm going to do that really quick. So as you can see, it very much works like the direct interactor, but sort of works on its own and doesn't need any input from us. Let's now do some quick functionality with the sort of events that we just took a look at. Let's disable this socket for the time being. Let's go to our grab interactable, and let's just have some functionality that happens when we are holding the object and we pull the trigger, so when we activate it. If we scroll down here, we'll say activated. We'll hit the plus sign, and we'll just drag in the object here. And we'll just like change the material or something like that on this object. So we'll just go to its mesh filter, its material, and let's just have a new beautiful material that we can use here. Let's just call it red for the time being. And we'll just put in a beautiful red that I have here. It is beautiful, I know. And we'll go back to our grab interactable, scroll down again, and we'll just drop in our red here. The thing is, if we wanted to, we can then change it back to our color that we had originally. You don't have to do this, but I'm just going to do it for the time being, I guess. And we'll put it back when it's deactivated. So you can actually see when we pull the trigger and when we release it. So you know what, there's actually some value in doing it. Test this really quick. And now that I'm holding my interactable, if I pull the trigger, you'll see it changes to that red color. And if I let go, it changes to the blue color. There we go. So as you can imagine, this is very useful if you're creating a weapon of some sort, if you want it to fire when you pull the trigger, or if you have like a drill or some sort of device with a trigger on it. And the thing is about interactables, not everything is going to be something that you can pick up and that you can move around. And I don't believe there is a XR example for that, but there is a component. So if we go to our grab interactable here, I'm going to duplicate it, make sure it's selected, and we'll remove this grab interactable, and we can add the simple interactable. And this is something we can't necessarily grab and move around, but it is something that we can still select and hover and activate. So if we wanted to, let's just work with the hovering functionality for the time being. And let's do kind of what we did before, where if we hover it, we'll change the color to red or something like that. And there we go. Let's actually not worry about this for the time being. So I'll hit to play again. So if we come into our scene view really quick, let's disable this grab interactable so it's a little bit easier for us to see. And we just have our simple interactable. And if you touch it, you see that it'll now turn red. So that's the sort of basics of some of the simple interactables, as well as the grabbable interactables, and some of the interactable events that we can work with. And I think that about does it for both interactors and interactables. Let's probably take another break, and when we come back, we're going to be talking about locomotion, teleporting, snap turning, all that good stuff. So see you in a bit. And we're back. We're going to be doing locomotion. This is also time that you are supposed to take a sip of your beverage, so do that now. Watered down store-bought cold brew. It's the best. Okay, so what we're going to be doing now is this is kind of where it doesn't get confusing, but it gets a little bit more intense a little bit. Don't worry, it'll be okay, I promise. And what we're going to be doing first is we'll set up teleporting, which all of that's pretty straightforward. We can not delete, but we'll disable these things within our scene. And to teleport, we're going to need a number of different things, but I actually don't know how many things we're going to need. I'm going to say 3. So we need a locomotion system, we need a teleportation provider, we need a teleport area, and those are the 3 main things we actually need. We'll also technically need a ray interactor, but that's not important. So I think I was right. We're going to go with 3. So, and the first thing that we're going to be doing is making our plane here a teleport area. So our system knows that, oh, I can teleport to this thing. It's much like an interactable. There's a lot of things that are in XR Toolkit that you may not realize are interactables, but they are. All of those things inherit from the XR-based interactable. You can technically, if you wanted to, reach down to the ground and grab it, and it will actually teleport you to that position if it is actually selectable. But we're not going to be doing that. We basically need to tell our ground, hey, like, this is an interactable, meaning when we point at it with our ray, that we can actually do stuff to it. So we can add a component here that we'll just call teleport area. And that's actually all we need to do for that. You'll notice that there's also a teleport anchor. So if we come in here, we'll see teleport area, and then we have the anchor as well. I don't know why the anchor is gigantic. What would happen? Yeah, I usually scale it down to 0.1. And then you can use this if you need the player to teleport in front of a table or a console or something like that, because you can also change the direction they're going to be facing with this anchor here. And you'll see that it has this nice little gizmo that's going to show you all that good stuff. But we don't necessarily need to be working with that. We're just going to be using the area for the time being. And what I also like to do usually is I come in here, I create an empty object. Sometimes I may child it even to the XR origin, and I would just call it locomotion. I think we might try and do smooth locomotion before the end of this video, so this might come back to bite us. I'm not exactly sure. We'll find out. So we'll reset the transform, and we're going to go to those 3 things that I talked about. we have the Locomotion system, which this essentially manages all of the different sort of providers or things that are going to be changing the position and the rotation of the XR origin. Kind of how I mentioned at the very beginning of the video, that's where all this functionality is. However, if you have multiple things that are trying to move the origin at the same time, you may get some unpredictable or undesirable results. So the system basically says, hey, this thing is already moving the origin, you need to essentially wait your turn. So you don't want to accidentally like snap rotate when you're teleporting or smooth locomotion when you're doing other things. But this is also useful if you want to build a climbing system or something like that, because as you're climbing, you necessarily don't want to be able to smooth locomotion away from the wall that you're climbing or something like that. Okay, so let's drag in our XR origin. You don't need to set up these references here, it'll do them automatically, but I'm a sociopath and that's just what I like to do. All right, so we'll go to teleportation provider now, and you'll know that it needs a locomotion system, so join in with me with being a sociopath and dragging our locomotion system into that. Great job. Your, I was gonna say diploma will be in the mail. And now that we've done that, we may, should we do snap turning right now? We'll just, we can also have another provider, which is the snap turn, or you can use the continuous, we'll control Z that, the continuous turn provider, which makes you smooth, or makes you turn smoothly, but I'm just gonna have it snap for the time being. Make sure that this is going to be action-based one as well, or it's not going to work. And we'll work on this in just a second. We're not going to worry about it too much. But you'll kind of see what the point of the locomotion system is. As we're adding these different providers to it, it's going to need to kind of say, hey, like, this thing's working, you're not supposed, don't do anything right now. But let's also add the locomotion system there. Cool. But for us to effectively use our teleport area, we need a ray interactor, unfortunately. And that's where sort of the XR Toolkit is sort of lacking a little bit, or is currently working on, is the use of these multiple interactors. I won't get up on my soapbox about how it currently does things and how I would do things differently. Point is, I do have a video that shows you how to use multiple interactors at once without too much of a headache. It's probably a little bit easier to do now, but we're not going to get into that too much. It's just a little bit too in depth for this video. But what we're going to do, hopefully this is the easiest way. If we come into our hierarchy, we'll go to XR and we'll just hit Ray Interactor Action Based. And this is going to be very similar to that thing we saw with the original XR origin. And we'll come to our controller here. We'll actually drag it up here. And we'll use it on our left hand. So let's disable this left hand that we currently have. And we'll just call this our left hand ray or something like that. And much like before, we'll apply our left-handed asset preset. And in theory, this should all already be good to go. If we wanted to, we could put the model prefab in here as well, but we do have this line visual that we're going to see in a moment that is going to help us know where our controller is. If we go to our teleport area again though, this does have some different settings, or at least the one that is going to be particularly helpful to you, which is when you want to actually teleport. If you want to teleport once you actually select the object, or when you're done selecting it, or when you've activated it, or when you've deactivated it. Most commonly, I just leave this on select exited because if you accidentally press down to teleport on something, if you're doing it by accident, you may want to point it somewhere else and release so you can sort of cancel that teleport. So we're just going to leave it on that for the time being. All right, so let's hit play. And let's see if this works. So you'll see here that I have my ray, but it's a little bit difficult to see because when I point at the ground, it's actually white. To make that a little bit easier, let's apply our hands material to that, and let's try that again. And all that looks to be working as expected. Let's now set up that snap turn provider. So let's go back to our locomotion, and we'll see that we need to set up some sort of action here, where much like our controllers, we can use a reference to those input actions that's coming from our starter assets. There's a lot of assets there, but we'll click on this little circle to find it, and we'll just type in turn, and it'll have our left and our right. Make sure whatever controller that you're clicking on, you're using the right action for it. So I'm just going to select the left hand turn right now, and you'll see that I have my left hand snap turn action and the turn action there. And all we need to do now is just hit play. And I can teleport and I can move my joystick left to right to snap turn. And all that's working as expected. I feel like I have to say that every time I demo something. I'm not doing it on purpose. It's just a habit, I guess, at this point. So now let's move on to some smooth locomotion. And hopefully this is going to work for us okay, but we'll figure it out. It's no worries. So we'll add another component to our locomotion system that we'll call continuous move provider. I keep calling it smooth locomotion, but I keep getting it confused with other namings. But it's going to be that continuous move provider. Make sure it's action-based. Drag that locomotion system. And instead of our left hand, we're going to use our right hand. So we're going to use a reference. We're going to come in here. We're going to type in move. And it's going to show our right hand move. And this is where this gets a little interesting. I don't know if we're biting off a little bit more than we can chew at the moment, but this is this is a bit of a crash course. We're actually going to set up an input action. So if we want to, you'll see why we're doing it in a second. But if we click this, I don't know if we can double click that. Yes, we can. It's going to bring it up in this input action window that we saw earlier. But if you'll notice that this is currently left empty, you'll notice that it doesn't have the arrow there. On the left hand, it does. So as of right now, XR Toolkit, when they set this up, they said, oh, they're probably only going to use movement on the left hand for whatever reason. So let's actually create our own little move action for our right controller. So if we select this, we'll go to move. We'll note that it's already set up correctly, so we're looking to get a value from it of type vector2. You don't have to worry about that. If you want to know more about this whole stuff, I would recommend looking into some more general input videos, because this is it's a very deep system, and even I'm not going to pretend to know all the ins and outs of it. But all we need to do is add a binding. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go to a path, we're going to go to our XR controller, make sure we go to our right hand specifically, optional controls, and we're going to get any inputs here that actually create a vector2. So we want to use the joystick to move, so we're going to use the primary axis. Make sure at this point that you hit save, and you know that it's saved correctly if that little asterisk that's on the left there is no longer there. And if we want to be super completionist, we'll double check this. This is going to be in the control scheme continuous move. We'll just add it there as well. This doesn't really matter for the time being, but we're just doing it to be consistent. And also to show you that asterisk, that's primary while I did it, so we could save that. Cool. So now let's go back to our locomotion, make sure that's all set up correctly, and now let's hit play. And this may be difficult to tell, but you'll see that I'm actually smooth moving throughout my little level here. And like I've said previously, it's all working as expected. One thing that you can also do is, as of right now, we're just moving the XR origin. But the thing is, there is an extra thing that we would need to prevent us from walking through walls and things like that. So this is maybe the section that this all comes crumbling down. We'll discover together. But if we go to our XR origin here, what we're going to do is we're going to add hopefully I remember the name. What was it? If I could spell it correctly, character controller driver. And we'll also want to add a character controller. Now, actually, I don't know if you can put this on a separate game object, but I know we need to have the character controller here on the XR origin. But you know what? Let's remove this, and I'm going to put it on the locomotion. So let's compress all of those, take that, and that makes it easier for us to drop in our locomotion provider. And let's click on our origin again, and we'll get a better look at it. And with every character controller, we have our little capsule here, and I'm just going to move it up by a meter, and that looks good. Let's hit play, and we'll actually don't know if this is going to work. And it may be easier to see within our scene view, and it actually looks to be working if I zoom out here. And the thing about this character controller driver is that the capsule for the character is going to only update when the player moves. And this is to prevent from, if you're trying to reach over tables and things like that, the collider isn't going to push you away. But as I'm moving around, you can see that the capsule is following the camera and is following the height of it as well. And that's all working as intended. But that largely does it for a lot of the core stuff that we're going to be working with. One thing that I didn't consider doing was using the Ray interactor for actually pressing buttons and doing UI interfaces, because that is almost a complete video in and of itself. So let's just see if we could do like a quick and dirty version. So if we zoom out here, let's create a UI and we'll go to button. I'm just going to use the current legacy button because I don't need to install TextMesh Pro at the moment. And usually when working with UI, it's usually best to scale down the canvas. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our render mode, go to world space, and I'm just going to do this like 0.001. We'll just try that. I usually use 0.05, I think, but we'll see. And we'll also set the position. That looks okay, actually. Let's do 1,000 in the width and 1,000 in the height. We'll move it away from the center, move it up, and we'll center our button here. That may be too small, actually. So let's, now it looks, see, these are the things of input that are not fun. I think that'll probably be fine. Let's just raise that up a little bit. Like I said, we're doing this by the seat of our pants now. I did not plan on doing this. But the thing is, when you use a canvas, there are a number of different things that we need to add for our Ray to interact with it properly. We're going to need an updated input module as well as the proper graphic raycaster, which essentially means, hey, we need the raycaster from our hand to be able to actually hit our canvas. So with our event system selected, we'll say replace input system UI input module, but I believe this isn't even the one that we want, because if we remove this, or actually let's delete it entirely, because if we go to XR, we'll go to UI event system, it'll actually have the proper input module for us. And also, now I'm second guessing this canvas as well. So let's delete that. This is why I tried to do this stuff live, so you could see me mess up, and then you'll go, oh, Andrew, you screwed up. This is how you're supposed to do it. So, you know, we're both learning here. We're both learning. So we'll actually do XR UI canvas, and it's going to have that track device graphic raycaster, where I actually don't even know if we need this normal raycaster, but we'll leave it there now, where it's actually going to let us hit the button that we're putting on here. But what's nice is it's actually setting up the render mode and the event camera, so that's actually super helpful. We should do it like that from now on. But now our canvas is a real big boy, so we got to make him smaller. So we'll do what we did previously, and we'll do 0.01. And for this size, I usually 500. Okay, this is actually looking a lot better. This is actually a little bit more similar to what I'm used to. So I think everything is good. Let's hit play and we'll see if this works. Make sure you're using the controller that has the actual Ray interactor on it. And as you can see, we can point at our button, we're going to get those hover events, and then when we pull the trigger, we can actually click it. But that's pretty much it for that. Alright, and I think that about does it. I think we did everything with quite a decent degree of success, so no particular issues. Hopefully you learned something, hopefully you liked this video. Hopefully it wasn't too confusing with me just sort of doing it off the cuff like this, but I thought it would just be a good time for us to sit down and just hang out and put it together. Put it together. Yeah, I mean, I think that's the only way you can say that. But if you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them below. I do answer almost all of them if I feel like I actually have an answer for it. I think I may do more XR Toolkit videos like this in the future. Sort of the long form and maybe some deep dives into particular mechanics and things like that. Maybe we can talk about the interaction manager or multi-hand interactions and all that good stuff once XR Toolkit continues to get more of those pretty intense features. But I think that's it for me. Thanks for watching. I'll see you around. Goodbye. But before I go for good, I would like to thank all of my wonderful patrons that continue to support me month after month so I can make videos like this. I'd specifically like to thank Todd Andler, Andreas Brillen, Balthazar, Juan Pyong Choi, Spectre XR, Mark Allen, and Mark A. Karoff. And now this is the actual end of the video. I'll see you all in the next one.